When General Dwight D. Eisenhower's troops stormed into Germany in the spring of 1945, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces made it clear that Berlin was not a target for them. He was sure that the reward of capturing the Nazi seat of power would be more valuable to the Russians, a fact that sparked bickering among Allied leaders, especially Churchill. The decision not to advance on the capital and last bastion of the Third Reich meant that no Americans participated in the Battle of Berlin. Or, at least, that's what the commanders assumed, but they did not count on the audacity of some American civilians who were at the center of the conflict. In today's video we are going to tell you why Eisenhower believed that the German city should not be invaded by the United States and its Western allies, and the controversies that this generated. In addition, we are going to discover the story of a group of American press correspondents willing to risk their lives to fulfill their task and be at the moment of the events to report them. Don't move from your screen for this new installment of military history. By April 12, 1945, the defeat of Hitler's Third Reich was virtually assured, despite the fact that Nazi troops were still entrenched and fighting in Berlin. Given this situation, why was Eisenhower so convinced not to take the city? The iron decision of the head of the U.S. Armed Forces to cede the city of Berlin to Stalin, as agreed in the Yalta pact, particularly annoyed Winston Churchill. Eisenhower argued that confronting the Soviets politically opened up the possibility that Allied and Soviet forces might mistakenly meet on the battlefield, turning political mistrust into military disaster. For his part, Churchill was in favor of seizing as much German territory as possible, including Berlin, to ensure that Stalin complied with the agreed agreements. It was clear that Churchill did not trust Stalin and wanted to ensure that the Soviet leader was conditioned when negotiating. The difference between the American and British position on the German capital was clear. According to Eisenhower, Berlin had been devastated by Allied bombing to the point that its military value was practically nil. From a political perspective, the capture of the German capital seemed equally hopeless, given that the limitations of what would be post-war occupation had already been set in Yalta between the Allied leaders. Both Eastern and Western Germany would be divided into 4 zones in power of the Soviets, Americans, British and French. Advancing on this Nazi stronghold also had a military cost, since it could mean up to 100,000 American casualties, a price that Eisenhower and his people were not willing to pay for an objective that had a merely propaganda value and that, furthermore, would be in part ceded to the Soviets. Despite the refusal of the American commanders to try to take the city of Berlin before the surrender, there were some Americans who did not want to be left out of this historic event. On April 27, 1945, just days before Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in the German capital, a daring and courageous journalist convinced a young army sergeant to take a jeep and drive into the heart of the dreaded besieged city. Despite the fact that it sounds implausible, this adventure was carried out without an adequate map or a real plan commensurate with the risks they were about to face. The protagonist of this journey was Virginia Irwin, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who would be one of the first, and only, Americans to witness the confrontation of Russian fighters with what was left of the Nazi forces. Recall that no American correspondent had been inside the Berlin city for years, as foreign reporters had been expelled in 1941. Irwin and his fellow travelers, Boston traveler journalist Andrew Tully, and the driver, Sergeant Johnny Wilson, witnessed incredible scenes. Despite the chaos of stinking bodies strewn on the sidewalks amid the ongoing fighting, exhausted Soviet soldiers marched through the ruins of the city singing and celebrating towards the final battle. According to what these reporters would tell in their chronicles, the state of mind of the Russian forces was due to two fundamental reasons. First, the ruthless sense of revenge displayed by the Soviets in response to the Nazi invasion of Russian soil and the well-known Operation Barbarossa, which left many casualties and damaged the pride and lands of Mother Russia. On the other hand, despite the nauseating smell of death from the bodies of the German soldiers, there was a certain air of relief and jubilation, since the end of the war was near. In Erwin's words, the Russians were happy, with an almost indescribable wild joy. They were in Berlin. In this German capital lay the true revenge for Leningrad and Stalingrad, for Sevastopol and Moscow. When Erwin and his companions arrived, the city was still under an artillery siege and the site of street-to-street combat as the Soviets subdued and slaughtered the Germans. The journalists and their guard had no protection for their opportunistic adventure, risking their safety in search of the first reports from Berlin. In fact, they were all identified with military uniforms and a correspondence patch, which meant that they were not stormtroopers and had no weapons, except for the driver of the jeep, Sergeant Wilson, who had an M1 rifle and his Colt pistol. Driving through the city aimlessly one night, the Americans stumbled across a Russian command post where they were greeted by a group of Soviet officers. Erwin's descriptions of the event were somewhere between dreamlike and festive. The Russian hosts celebrated his arrival, while the war continued to unfold a few blocks away. The roar of the bombs shaking the ground and the noise of the bullets filling the air with the smell of gunpowder and death followed one another while the Soviet vigilante group danced and celebrated with them, toasting Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt and Truman with vodka. The next morning the trio was ready to continue collecting testimonies and information for their chronicles, but even though the war was nearing its end, the hostilities were still going on. The deep sense of revenge on the Soviet side and, above all, the corresponding fear among the Germans who remained in Berlin fighting were palpable, as some continued to fight for the Nazi cause and others tried not to surrender fearing what might happen to them as prisoners of war. The Erwin-led trio made repeated attempts to reach Unter den Linden, the city's most famous and central boulevard, but eventually recognized that doing so would mean a suicide mission. On the evening of April 28, the correspondents decided it was time to return to friendlier territory, so they headed for the American camp on the Elbe. Repeating the route by which they had arrived in Berlin in reverse, they arrived at a Russian checkpoint on the banks of the same river where they were denied passage. Ingeniously and somewhat unconsciously, Erwin stood on the east bank of the Elbe and yelled to the American troops on the other side, "I'm an American woman, come rescue me from these Russians." A few hours later, 2 US-flagged assault boats crossed to rescue the correspondent and her fellow passengers. Once Erwin and Tully returned to camp, the authorities chastised them, refusing to approve their chronicles. They were left inactive and confined while the German surrender took place, until they were finally deported to the United States. It was not until May 8, known as European Victory Day to commemorate the surrender of the Nazis to the Allies, that the first of Erwin's reports appeared in the Post-Dispatch with the impressive date and place of writing, Berlin, Germany, April 27, 1945. However, this group would not be the only gang of American correspondents to be discredited for sneaking into Berlin without authorization. On May 3, 1945, the day after Berlin had officially surrendered, John Groth, an artist and correspondent for American Legion magazine, along with Seymour Frieden of the New York Herald Court, were going to try to get a first-hand account. Traveling with them were 2 U.S. Army photographers, Ernie Liza of Wipes and Stripes and Mac Morris of Yank magazine. The delegation set out on the road towards the German capital and found a Soviet checkpoint where they convinced the guards to let them pass and thus managed to access Berlin, which was unrecognizable.
Everything was ruins. The traditional German buildings were collapsed, bombed and covered in soot.
On the sidewalks were piles and piles of discarded weapons and piles of Nazi corpses. The stench of decomposing bodies was everywhere, the correspondents described in their reports. Then they headed for the Reich Chancellery, where triumphant Soviet soldiers had hung a black and white gigantic photograph of Stalin above the rubble of the building. The view along Unter den Linden in the direction of the Brandenburg Gate with communist red flags flying on the poles was impressive. This small convoy witnessed the last clashes between the Soviets and the few Germans who still had artillery left and intended to fight to the death, even though their nation had already formally surrendered. This group was to suffer the same fate as Erwin and Tully for violating security orders from their superiors. Frieden and Groth were discredited and sent back to the United States, while Army soldiers Liza and Morris, who could not be discredited, were suspended as punishment. Western Allied forces officially entered Berlin on July 4, 1945, 2 months after these brave journalists and photographers ventured east to witness firsthand the final moments of World War II and the fall of the Third Reich.
We are coming to the end of this installment and we wanted to ask you, do you think that Eisenhower's strategy was correct? And, on the other hand, do you think it was necessary for journalists and soldiers to be punished? Leave your opinions in the comments below. We are waiting for you in the next installments of Military History.